Good day, everyone. English is a universal language. That is why people are so eager to learn the English language. Language learners expose themselves into different avenues to acquire the language. Avenues such as home, media, school, and extramural activities. And that is what our study all about. We, English education students from Rizal Technological University, present our language research study titled Sources of Exposure to English, Avenue to Language Acquisition. Conflicting issues as to whether language acquisition is nature or nurture, the researchers focus on external factors that influence language acquisition, which is nurture. The researchers aimed to answer the following question. First, what are the sources of language exposure? Second, what is the extent of language exposure? And last, what is the impact of exposure to language acquisition? To discuss the methodology that we use in this research, I would like to give the virtual floor to Ms. Paet.
Thank you so much for that, Ms. Giva. And to use the appropriate approach to administer the study and provide accurate results, we, the researchers, utilize a descriptive approach through mixed method, wherein quantitative analysis was used to statistically analyze the data gathered from SOP 1 and 2 by computing the weighted mean, and qualitative for thematically analyzing the data gathered from SOP 3. So in our study, we used quota sampling. We targeted a total population of 80 respondents from both Rizal Technological University, Boni, and Pasig campuses, who are currently third-year college students enrolled under Bachelor Secondary Education major in English. Moreover, we gathered data from our respondents through an online survey questionnaire by utilizing Google Forms. And then after that, we conducted an online panel interview through Google Meet from 12 of our respondents. We use an adapted survey questionnaire partnered with a panel interview to obtain data needed to answer the SOP 1 to 3. So the content of the survey questionnaire is adapted from the study of Al-Zubi in 2018, from the study of Magno and others as well in 2009, which is definitely validated by language professionals. So for the data gathering procedures, of course, we have sought the permission of the panelists, including our research advisor. Then we disseminated the online survey questionnaires in our group chats. We also sought the permission of our respondents, of course. And then after we reached our quota, we conducted a panel interview with 12 of the participants. And lastly, after we gathered all the data, we proceeded with data analysis and interpretation. And with that being said, let us now move on with the presentation of the results of our study, which will be presented by Ms. Fortich.
For the summary of findings through the data gathered and analyzed by the researchers, we, the researchers, came up with the various findings that answered our proposed three-statement of the problem in our study. First, the researchers find out what are the sources of language exposure. We find out that overall, with a general weighted mean of 3.67, the respondents strongly agree that all the presented sources of exposure play a significant role in their language acquisition. The presented sources of exposure refers to practicing the English language outside the classroom in many contexts, watching English TV programs, videos, or movie, using social media apps such as Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, surfing the internet, communicating in English outside the classroom. Aside from this, we also find out the extent of their exposure to these sources. Through our study, we found out that the research participants are always exposed to the English language through various media, gaining the highest general weighted mean of 3.91. Therefore, the findings imply that respondents have the highest exposure to the English language through media, particularly because the information the respondents are reading are written in English, gaining the highest mean of 3.80 on media. Aside from this, The researchers also investigated what is the impact of exposure to language acquisition. The impact of exposure to different sources of exposure in language acquisition is first, the use of the actual language in language acquisition is also a practice in acquiring the English language. Watching videos, particularly English subtitle films and reading materials through extensive reading, contributed to the vocabulary enhancement and pronunciation of the English major students. Furthermore, listening extensively to audiovisual materials, and listening to people who speak fluently in English results in English major students developing skills, speaking skills in English, and having effective communication skills. To further understand the findings of our study, Ms. Aguilan will discuss the conclusion and recommendations.
Now, here are the conclusions that were derived based on the aforementioned findings. First, this paper concluded that the respondents strongly agreed that the exposure to the English language was the most effective source for developing proficiency in English. With that being said, this paper suggests that the English language learners should explore different types of exposure to identify which will benefit them the best. Next is for them to continuously practice using the language even outside the classroom in order for them to improve their fluency and mastery. Next is for them to give attention in identifying and improving areas that they struggle with. For example, the confidence, grammar, pronunciation, diction, and delivery. And lastly, for them to avoid settling for instructed learning. Next one. This paper concluded that the respondents are highly exposed to the English language through media and have significantly low exposure to the language at home. With that being said, this paper suggests or recommends that the learners must continuously expose themselves to the English language through various ways, such as browsing web pages, listening to songs, watching videos, and reading media contents that are all written in English. Next is for them to utilize English, or for teachers to utilize English as the medium of instruction in school, maximizing the use of English in school activities, and encourage students as well to use English during discussion. Next is finding an authentic and quality source of language exposure, as well as exposing themselves to an environment where they can interact with people who are knowledgeable about the language. And lastly, family members are encouraged to speak in English since in the conclusion, as I have mentioned earlier, that the respondents have low exposure to the language at home. Lastly, this paper concluded that the different sources of exposure to the English language plays a pivotal role in acquiring and enhancing language acquisition. So exposure to the language, such as in school, that serves as a training ground for the language learner and has an English-only policy or EOP, leads to language acquisition through the use of the language in actual conversation within the school, family, and friends who serves as the listeners while having conversation in English, and extramural activities with English engagement are effective avenues in language acquisition. Now with that, this study recommends that the schools or the teachers take this in consideration first, for the teachers to make reading books a requirement to enhance the learners' vocabulary. Next, for the teachers to implement EOP inside the class so that the learners can practice the use of language. Third, it is also recommended that the language learners be encouraged to engage in out-of-school activities and for the target language to be used in daily life conversation. It is also suggested to have extensive reading and listening listening activities, since this paper proved that it greatly impacts students' language acquisition skills. Next is for the teachers to employ multimedia or use multimedia inside the classroom, because this gives the students real-world content and helps them maximize their language input and output. Included there is the use of audiovisual materials as well, as this provides an opportunity for the learners to be more familiar with the language.